By 5:42 that morning, Hollow Bend had disappeared. The fog was so thick the county road looked like it ended 20 feet ahead. It did not drift like ordinary fog. It sat low and heavy over the tracks, swallowing fence posts, ditch banks, warning signs, and the pale beams of headlights until every driver on that road felt like they were moving through a white room with no walls. The new smart crossing lights blinked once, stopped, then blinked again for no reason. A clinic ambulance sat trapped near the tracks with a patient inside, its red strobes flashing uselessly against the fog. Behind it, 2 school buses waited, full of children who had gone quiet because even children know when adults are afraid. Somewhere beyond that white wall, a freight train was already moving down the grade toward Hollow Bend. The engineers kept staring at their tablets. The system said the track was clear. Silas Boone knew it was lying. He stepped out of his old blue pickup with 3 broken railroad lanterns, a hand-cranked signal lamp, and the same calm face he had worn 40 years earlier, back when men still trusted glass, flame, distance, and memory more than screens. The youngest engineer shouted, "You can't interfere with an automated crossing." Silas looked at the half-lowered gate. Then he looked at the fog swallowing the rails. "I'm not interfering," he said. "I'm translating." Before sunrise ended, those old lanterns would save more than a line of cars. They would reopen a buried railroad lie from 1971. If stories about forgotten skills, old warnings, and the people we dismiss too quickly mean something to you, consider subscribing, because what happened at Hollow Bend was not just about a failed crossing or an old man with broken lanterns. It was about a truth that had waited 50 years for the fog to return. 3 weeks before the fog swallowed Hollow Bend, the county held a ribbon-cutting ceremony beside the tracks. They brought folding chairs, a white tent, 2 local reporters, and a banner stretched across the temporary fence. Hollow Bend Smart Rail Safety Upgrade. Under it stood the people who had built the system. County officials, contractors, engineers in reflective vests, and Maya Cross, 31, sharp-eyed, careful, and proud in the quiet way of someone who had worked too hard to be dismissed. She explained it to the crowd. Motion detection, weather monitoring, automated gates, remote diagnostics, real-time alerts to dispatch. Every word made the old crossing look more useless. 20 yards down the rail, the manual signal post still stood crooked in the weeds, black paint peeling, empty bracket rusted where a lamp once hung. Most people ignored it. Silas Boone did not. He stood at the edge of the crowd in a faded railroad cap and brown work coat, holding a cracked red lantern under one arm. At 82, his shoulders had narrowed, but his eyes still followed the tracks like a man listening to a voice he had known all his life. His grandson Jonah stepped beside him. "Granddad," Jonah said quietly, "please don't." Silas kept looking at the crossing. "They're taking the post down. It's a dead post." "No," Silas said. "It's a second language." Jonah glanced toward the engineers. "Not today." But Silas was already walking forward. The commissioner was thanking the contractors when the old man passed the folding chairs. Heads turned. The photographer lowered his camera. Maya gave him a polite smile. "Sir, we'll take questions after the demonstration." "This crossing hasn't been tested in Hollow Bend fog," Silas said. Maya's smile tightened. "It has been tested under state and federal safety models. Models don't sit in that ditch at dawn." A few people chuckled. Maya stayed professional. "The system includes visibility and moisture monitoring." Silas pointed toward the low curve where the rails bent between the cottonwoods. "Fog here rides under the eye line. It steals distance before it steals sight. Your sensors may read the road before they understand the rail." This time, the chuckle spread wider. Grant Keller, a contractor behind Maya, laughed through his nose. His boots were too clean for railroad gravel. "Mr. Boone, is it?" Grant said. Silas looked at him. Grant pointed at the lantern. "Is that your diagnostic tool?" The crowd laughed. Not all of them meant to be cruel. Some laughed because Grant sounded important. Some laughed because they were uncomfortable. Some laughed because an old man with cracked glass beside a smart crossing looked like the past refusing to move. But laughter changes a place. It gives people permission. Someone near the back said, "Maybe he wants us to light candles too." Jonah's face reddened. "Granddad," he whispered, "come on." Silas did not move. "I'm asking you to leave the manual post standing for 3 weeks," he said. The commissioner frowned. 3 weeks? Until the first heavy fog after a cold rain. Grant shook his head. Absolutely not. We have a completion deadline. That post is obsolete. It won't hurt your system to leave it. It hurts the contract, Grant said. There it was. Not safety. Not memory. Not warning. Contract. Jonah stepped forward, embarrassed and worried. I'm sorry. He worked rail for a long time. He gets fixed on things. Silas turned his head slowly. That hurt more than Grant's laughter. Because Jonah loved him. Jonah brought groceries. Jonah patched the shed roof. Jonah sat with him through winter storms when the lights flickered. But love can still wound when it is ashamed. Maya softened her voice. Mr. Boone, I promise you, the system is safe. Silas looked past her toward the bend. My father heard that once. The laughter faded a little. No one asked what he meant. That was how towns handled old pain. They stepped around it until it became part of the floor. Grant clapped his hands once. Let's proceed with the demonstration. A technician tapped the tablet. The warning lights flashed perfectly. The gates lowered smoothly. A test signal appeared on the screen. The crowd applauded. The photographer caught Maya smiling beside the cabinet, while the old manual post stood behind her, half outside the frame. Silas watched every second. The system worked beautifully under a clear blue sky, and that was exactly what frightened him. When the ceremony ended, Jonah walked him back to the pickup. You can't keep doing this, Jonah said. People already think you're living in the past. Silas placed the cracked red lantern on the passenger seat. I am, he said. That's where they buried the warning. That evening, Silas went into his shed alone. He pulled the chain on the overhead bulb. Yellow light spread across wooden crates stacked against the wall. 23 railroad lanterns waited there, wrapped in old feed sacks, each tagged in his handwriting. Red, yellow, green, blue, white. Silas opened the smallest crate and lifted out the lantern with the damaged brass plate. He rubbed his thumb across the serial number until the last 2 digits caught the light. Outside, the new smart crossing gave a distant test chirp in the dark. Silas looked toward the sound and whispered, Not again. Silas Boone learned the railroad before he learned multiplication. His first memories were not of toys or schoolbooks, but of iron rails warming under summer sun, cinders popping beneath passing wheels, and his father's hand closing around his small shoulder whenever a train came too close. Amos Boone was a signal maintainer on the Hollow Bend line, a quiet man who listened before he spoke. He could tell by a horn whether a freight was pulling heavy. He could tell by vibration whether the wheels were flat. He could stand in fog and know where the bend swallowed sound. At night, he carried lanterns the way a preacher carried a Bible, because meaning depended on the hand holding it. A light only matters, Amos told his son, if a man respects what it means. Silas was 9 when he first cleaned red glass at the kitchen table. Amos let him polish each globe with a rag darkened by soot and kerosene. Red meant stop. Yellow meant caution. Green meant clear. Blue meant men working. White meant a hand signal had to be read with care. Those rules became part of Silas's bones. By 16, he knew which post at Hollow Bend iced first in winter. By 18, he had learned that fog there was not weather so much as a living thing. It rose from the ditch, crawled low across the ballast, and bent sound until a train seemed farther away than it was. Amos never trusted Hollow Bend in fog. Neither did Silas. In 1971, when Silas was 27, the accident happened. It was a February morning, cold after rain, with fog pressed low over the road. A short freight was coming down the grade. A maintenance crew had been clearing near the bend. A brakeman named Earl Tanner was assigned to confirm the stop signal before the crew crossed equipment over the track. The report later said Earl missed it. The report said the red signal was visible. The report said the crossing procedures had been followed. The report said a lot of things that made the railroad company sound unfortunate instead of responsible. Earl Tanner died with his name bent under those words. Silas remembered the day after the funeral. Earl's wife stood outside the depot in a dark coat, holding the hand of a little girl who kept asking when her father was coming home. No one knew what to say to them. Worse, some people said the wrong things in lowered voices. Careless. Distracted. Should have checked the light. After that, the Tanners became a family people pitied from a distance and blamed up close. Amos came home late the night the investigation closed. He sat at the kitchen table with his railroad cap in both hands and stared at the stove as if the fire inside had gone out. Silas asked what had happened. Amos said only, "Some lights disappear after they've already done their damage." The next morning, 3 lanterns were missing from the rack in the shed. A week later, they were back, wrapped in feed sacks. Silas saw one tag before his father pushed the crate beneath the workbench. "Le Fjorten," he asked about it once. Amos slapped the bench so hard the lantern glass rattled. "Leave buried things buried," he said. It was the only time Silas remembered being afraid of his father. After that, the Boone house changed. Amos still went to work. He still trimmed wicks. He still checked posts in bad weather. But the quiet in him became heavier. He stopped singing with the radio. He stopped going to church suppers if anyone from the railroad office would be there. When Silas's mother asked why he woke at night, Amos said his knees hurt. Silas knew that was not the truth. Years later, when the railroad modernized the line and removed the old lamp brackets, Amos brought home lanterns that should have gone to scrap. He cleaned them, tagged them, and stored them in crates. He never explained why certain serial numbers mattered. He only kept the lanterns close, like a man keeping witnesses alive after everyone else had left the courtroom. Then Amos died with the secret still folded inside him. No confession, no apology, no final instruction except a sentence spoken in a hospital bed while rain tapped the window. "Don't let them take the lights." Silas obeyed. He kept every lantern. He kept Amos's signal notebook. He kept the brass plates, the chipped globes, the tags written in his father's cramped hand. He told himself he was preserving railroad history. He told Jonah the lanterns were tools. He told the county they were personal property. But in the private room of his own heart, Silas believed something simpler. His father had been forced to stay silent. One day, the lanterns would prove it. That belief carried him through decades of small humiliations, through neighbors asking why he still kept old wreckage, through collectors offering cash as if memory could be priced by the piece, through Jonah, grown now and worried, standing under the leaking shed roof and saying, "Granddad, this place is falling apart, and you're saving broken glass." Jonah was not wrong about the roof. Water had stained 2 beams. The old house needed repairs. Silas's pension covered food, medicine, property tax, and not much else. One dealer had offered enough for Red 14 to replace half the shingles. Silas refused before the man finished speaking. To Jonah, it looked like stubbornness. To Silas, it felt like guarding the last honest thing Amos had left behind. And that was the wound no one saw. Silas was not simply defending antiques. He was defending the idea that his father had been a good man trapped by a bad company. He needed that to be true, because if Amos had known more than he admitted, if Amos had allowed Earl Tanner's name to stay buried under a lie, then the lanterns were not only proof, they were accusation. The morning after the ribbon cutting, Silas opened Amos's old notebook again. Most entries were ordinary: dates, post numbers, weather notes, lamp repairs, but near the middle, beside the week of the 1971 accident, Amos had written a line so lightly it almost vanished into the paper. Red 14 missing before report. Silas touched the words. Outside, far across the hollow, the new smart crossing gave another clean electronic chirp. It sounded confident. Silas closed the notebook and looked toward the shed, where 23 old lanterns waited in the dark. For the first time in years, he wondered whether they had been waiting not to clear his father's name, but to tell him what his father never could. And to understand that, he would have to look harder at the thing everyone else kept calling junk. To most people, Silas Boone's shed looked like a place where useful things went to die. The roof sagged in the middle. Rain had darkened the boards near the back wall. A workbench leaned under coffee cans full of bolts, old switch keys, cracked insulators, folded rail maps, and pieces of wire saved for reasons no one under 60 could understand. Jonah saw a fire hazard. The county inspector saw a code violation. Neighbors saw one more sign that Silas had stayed alone too long. But Silas saw order. Every crate had a tag. Every shelf had a purpose. Every lantern had a place. 23 railroad lanterns sat along the north wall, each wrapped in feed sack cloth and marked in pencil. Silas did not keep them in a pile. He kept them like records. Red stop lamps on the lower shelf, yellow caution lamps above them, green clear lamps to the right. Blue work crew lamps in their own crate. White hand signal lamps wrapped separately because white could mean too many things in the wrong hand. That was what people never understood. The lanterns were not decorations. They were language. A red lantern held steady meant stop. A yellow lantern swung low meant ease down. A white sweep across the body meant back up slow. A blue light near equipment meant men were working and no engine had the right to move. The meaning changed with height, motion, distance, and who was holding it. A screen could show data. A lantern could show intention. Silas still cleaned them once a month. He checked the collars, bail handles, burner assemblies, wire guards, and globe markings. He trimmed old wicks even when he had no reason to light them. He polished the brass plates with the same worn rag Amos had used, not to make them pretty, but to keep the numbers readable. Serial numbers mattered. Repairs mattered. Wrong glass mattered most of all. That was why Red 14 sat apart from the rest. It looked ordinary at first. A stop lantern with a blackened top, a bent handle, and one long crack through the red globe. But the globe was not the one listed in Amos's notebook. The shade was slightly darker, almost wine-colored, when sunlight crossed it. The rim had been soldered by a different hand. The brass plate showed scratches where someone had tried to dull the number without fully removing it. Silas had noticed all of that years ago. He had never told Jonah. Jonah would have said the same thing. He always said, "Granddad, old things get repaired." That was true. But old repairs had reasons. One Saturday morning, Jonah came to the shed with a roll of roofing tape, a worried look, and a young man from the county office. The man wore a clean shirt, carried a clipboard, and kept his boots just outside the doorway. "Mr. Boone," the inspector said, "we've had a complaint about stored combustibles." Silas looked at Jonah. Jonah looked away. "I didn't file a complaint," Jonah said. "I asked what could happen if something caught." The inspector pointed his pen toward the crates. Kerosene lanterns, old fuel residue, paper wrapping, unstable shelving. "This needs to be cleared or secured." "They're empty," Silas said. "Empty things still burn." Silas almost smiled. "Not as fast as forgotten things." The inspector did not understand the answer. Jonah did, or at least understood enough to become uncomfortable. After the inspector left, Jonah stood among the crates and rubbed both hands over his face. He was 32, tired from work, tired from bills, tired from loving a man who would rather argue with the past than fix the roof over his own head. "Do you know what Red 14 is worth?" Jonah asked. Silas said nothing. "There's a dealer in Street Lewis, railroad collectors. He said certain hollow bend lanterns are rare. He said if the serials are right, one red lamp could pay for half the roof." Silas turned to the shelf. "No, you didn't even hear the number." "I heard enough." Jonah's voice sharpened. "You can't live inside a shed full of broken glass." Silas lifted Red 14 carefully and set it on the workbench between them. "This one was listed at the bend." Jonah stared at it. "Listed where?" "In your great-grandfather's book." "Then that makes it family history." "No," Silas said. "It makes it a question." Jonah sighed, and the sound carried more fear than anger. Questions don't keep rain out. For a moment, Silas had no answer, because that was true too. The house needed shingles. The porch steps were soft. The winter heating bill had doubled. There were mornings when his fingers hurt so badly he had to run warm water over them before he could button his shirt. $1,000, $5,000. Any real money would have changed something, but if he sold Red 14, the question would leave with it. 2 days later, the dealer came anyway. His name was Nolan Price, a smooth man in a brown leather jacket who knew enough railroad vocabulary to sound respectful and enough market value to sound generous. He admired the lanterns one by one, but his eyes kept returning to Red 14. "That globe is interesting," Nolan said. "Wrong," Silas replied. Nolan looked up. "Excuse me? That glass is wrong." The dealer smiled carefully. "Replacement glass can increase curiosity. Collectors like irregularities. Collectors like stories they can own. And families like roofs that don't leak," Nolan said. The words landed too close to Jonah's argument to be accidental. Silas covered Red 14 with the feed sack. Nolan's smile faded. "Mr. Boone, I'm offering you a fair private price before the county takes an interest. Once the crossing project expands, old rail property gets complicated. Things disappear into storage. Paperwork takes over." Silas looked at him then. For the first time, the dealer stopped looking like a buyer. He looked like a warning. After Nolan left, Silas opened Amos's notebook and placed red 14 beside the page from 1971. The entry was faint, but the words were still there. Red 14 missing before report. Silas turned the lantern slowly under the workbench light. On the underside of the rim, beneath soot and old solder, he saw a mark he had missed before. 2 small initials scratched into the metal. A. T. Earl Tanner. Silas sat down. The shed seemed to go quiet around him. For years, he had believed the lanterns were waiting to defend Amos Boone. But Red 14 carried another man's initials, another family's ruin, and perhaps another claim on the truth. By morning, Silas knew he could no longer simply guard the lanterns. He would have to try to make someone listen, and that first attempt would make the town laugh harder than before. Silas Boone did not sleep much after finding Earl Tanner's initials on Red 14. Before sunrise, he sat at the kitchen table with Amos's notebook open beside a mug of coffee gone cold. Red 14 rested on a folded towel in front of him. Under the weak yellow light, the lantern looked less like an antique than a witness too old to speak without help. Silas wrote 3 things on a notepad. Folktest. Lefjorten. Do not remove post. That was all he wanted at first. Not an investigation, not a public apology. He wanted them to delay removal of the manual signal post and run one real test under the kind of fog that had shaped Hollow Bend for generations. Jonah drove him to the county transit office because Silas's hands were too stiff that morning to trust the wheel. The ride was quiet until they reached town. You can still turn around, Jonah said. Silas looked at the crate between his boots. I already did that for 50 years. Jonah had no answer. At the office, Maya Cross agreed to meet them for 10 minutes in a small conference room behind the reception desk. Grant Keller came too, though no one had invited him. He stood near the wall with his arms crossed, wearing a smile that said he had already decided the meeting was a waste. Silas placed Red 14 on the table. Then he laid Amos's notebook beside it. Maya leaned forward despite herself. Grant did not. This lantern was listed at Hollow Bend in 1971, Silas said. My father wrote that it went missing before the accident report was filed. Grant gave a short laugh. With respect, handwritten family notes are not system data. I'm not asking you to reopen 1971 today, Silas said. I'm asking you to test the crossing in real Hollow Bend fog before you remove the manual post. Maya touched the edge of the notebook but did not pick it up. Mr. Boone, the crossing has passed required simulation. Simulation does not make sound bend, Silas said. Fog there changes distance. Grant stepped in. Fog is included in the environmental model. Silas looked at him. Not that fog. For a moment, Maya's eyes moved toward the window, toward the low part of town where the tracks disappeared behind buildings. Silas saw the smallest hesitation in her face. Then Grant opened his folder. The project has a completion deadline, he said. Final certification is scheduled for Friday. Removing the old post is part of site clearance. Leaving abandoned hardware beside an active crossing creates liability. Removing backup creates danger, Silas said. Grant smiled again. Only if the certified system fails. Silas did not blink. They always sound certified before they fail. That was when the clerk at the front desk looked in. Then another county worker. The room had glass walls, and people had begun noticing the old man with a lantern again. Maya lowered her voice. Mr. Boone, I understand your concern. But there is no evidence that this system will misread the track. Silas lifted Red 14, turning the damaged brass plate toward her. Evidence starts somewhere. Grant sighed, louder than necessary. No. Evidence starts with records, chain of custody, calibrated instruments, and actual fault codes. Not scratched initials and ghost stories. The words moved through the glass room faster than they should have. Ghost stories. Silas heard someone outside repeat it softly. Jonah stood. That's enough. But Silas remained seated. His face had gone still in the way it did when pain had traveled too deep for expression. Maya looked embarrassed, but she did not correct Grant. That silence mattered. Grant gathered his papers. We are not delaying a county safety project because Mr. Boone has emotional attachment to obsolete rail equipment. Silas closed Amos's notebook. The meeting ended without a vote because there had never really been a meeting. On the way out, a young county employee whispered, "There's the lantern guy," and another one laughed before pretending not to. Jonah heard it. Silas heard it. Neither spoke until they were outside. "You see?" Jonah said, hurt breaking through his patience. "This is what I mean. They're making you into a joke." Silas looked back at the office windows. A joke is still a sound. Silence is worse. That afternoon, Maya ran the scheduled demonstration again for the county commissioners. The sky was clear. The rails shone dry. The control panel responded perfectly. The gates dropped at the right time, rose at the right time, and sent clean alerts to the tablet in Maya's hand. Everything worked. Grant made sure Silas saw it. He invited the local reporter to film the final test from the edge of the road. The video was online before supper. In it, the new crossing performed flawlessly while Silas Boone stood in the background holding a red lantern like a man waiting for a century that was not coming back. The caption read, "Old rail worker questions, smart crossing, system passes final test." By evening, Jonah had seen 3 comments from people he knew. "Poor old Silas needs to let progress happen. Somebody take that lantern before he starts directing traffic." The third was worse because it came from a cousin. "Jonah, get your granddad some help." Jonah closed his phone and set it face down. Silas was in the shed. He had placed 3 lanterns on the bench, red 14, a yellow caution lamp, and a white hand signal lantern with a cracked chimney. Beside them lay the hand-cranked signal lamp Amos had kept wrapped in canvas. Jonah stood in the doorway. "What are you doing?" "Practicing." "For what?" Silas lit the white lamp, lowered the shed lights, and moved the beam across his own chest in a slow sweep. "Back up." He lifted yellow low and swung it once. "Ease down." Then he held red steady at shoulder height. "Stop." Jonah watched, no longer angry, not exactly. Something about the old motions made the shed feel less like a junk room and more like a language class for a world that had forgotten the alphabet. Still, fear returned to his voice. They passed the test. Silas blew out the lamp. "No," he said, "they passed the weather." Outside, the night air had begun to cool. Somewhere beyond the cottonwoods, frogs called from the ditch below Hollow Bend. Silas opened Amos's notebook to the page marked February 1971 and added one new line beneath his father's old words. "Final test, clear sky." "Manual post, still scheduled for removal." He paused, then wrote another line. "Need fog." 2 mornings later, before anyone expected it, the first sign came. The first sign came before sunrise, when the town was still sleeping, and Hollow Bend had not yet become a crisis. Silas was awake because his knees hurt when rain was coming. He sat by the kitchen window with Amos's notebook open beside him and a cup of coffee cooling in his hand. Outside, the world looked unfinished. The porch rail was wet. The cottonwoods were black shapes against a gray sky. Down beyond the pasture, fog had begun to gather low in the hollow. Not thick enough to blind a man, just enough to test a machine. Silas put on his coat. He did not take red 14. Not that morning. He took a small pocket camera Jonah had bought him years ago, the kind with buttons too small for old fingers, and drove his pickup to the gravel shoulder above the crossing. At 6:08, the smart crossing lights blinked once, then stopped. Silas leaned forward behind the windshield. A moment later, the lights blinked twice, too close together, then went dark again. The gates did not move. No train was coming. No car was on the track. Only fog lay low over the road, sliding across the ditch and lifting just enough to catch the pale signal lights. Silas raised the camera. By the time he pressed the button, the lights had gone still. He waited. At 6:14, a mail truck came over the rise, its headlights dim behind the fog. The driver slowed, as most locals did at Hollow Bend, then rolled forward when the crossing stayed open. The truck's front wheels passed the painted stop line. That was when the warning bell chirped. Not a full alarm, a chirp. One short electronic sound, cut off halfway. The left gate dropped 3 feet, stopped, and lifted again as if changing its mind. The mail truck braked hard. Its rear tires slid on damp gravel. The driver threw both hands up, confused and angry, then backed away from the tracks before the gate rose completely. No train came. That was the problem. If a train had come, people would have understood danger. Because no train came, the moment looked like nothing more than a nuisance. Silas took 3 photographs. All of them were nearly useless. Fog washed out the lights. The gate arm blurred. The mail truck appeared only as a pale rectangle with red brake lights bleeding into white air. Still, Silas wrote the time in his notebook. 6:14. Gate false drop. Fog low. No train visible. Mail truck delayed. The driver rolled down his window as he passed the shoulder. "Things jumpy this morning," he called. Silas asked. "You report it?" The man shrugged. "To who?" "It fixed itself." That sentence followed Silas all the way home. It fixed itself. That was how danger survived. Not by hiding completely, but by correcting itself before anyone important had to admit it had happened. At 9 o'clock, Silas called the county transit office. The receptionist put him on hold. When Maya Cross finally answered, her voice sounded polite but tired. "Mr. Boone, if this is about the post, the gate false. Dropped at 6:14. Silence." Then paper moved on her end. "Are you sure? I watched it. Was there a train in the block?" "No." "Was there a vehicle on the track?" "Mail truck near the stop line." Another pause. This one was different. Maya said, "I'll check the log." By noon, she was at Hollow Bend with a tablet in one hand and a technician beside her. Grant Keller arrived 10 minutes later in his white truck, and the moment he stepped out, the air changed. Maya had been looking at the control cabinet with worry. Grant looked at it like a man looking at money that had been insulted. Silas stood near the gravel shoulder. Jonah had come too, because after the local video and the county meeting, he no longer trusted what people might say if Silas stood alone. Maya read from the tablet. There was a moisture warning at 6:13, then a gate diagnostic interruption at 6:14. It cleared in 4 seconds. Grant leaned over her shoulder. "So no fault." "A diagnostic interruption is something," Maya said. "It cleared," Grant replied. "That means the system corrected." Silas looked at him. The mail truck corrected. The driver stopped. Grant turned. "Do you have clear evidence of that?" Silas held out the camera. Maya looked through the photos. Her expression did not dismiss them, but it did not brighten either. The images were too fogged, too blurred, too easy for a lawyer to ignore. Grant glanced at one and handed the camera back. That could be anything. It was the gate. It could be glare. It could be brake lights. It could be a man who expected to see failure and found a shadow. Jonah stepped forward. He wrote the time down. Grant's smile was thin. "With respect, Mr. Boone's notes are not system logs." Maya did not speak. That silence was not the same as before. At the ribbon cutting, her silence had protected Grant. Now it protected her own uncertainty. She walked to the ditch beside the rail bed and looked down into the wet grass. The fog was gone by then, burned off by weak sun. Without it, Hollow Bend looked harmless again. That was another trick the place played. It erased evidence when daylight came. Maya crouched near the ditch water. Silas noticed. Grant noticed too. "Maya," he said, "we don't need to turn weather into a mystery." She stood slowly. "There may be reflection interference from pooled water. There may be driver confusion," Grant said. "Put that in the note." Maya looked at the crossing, then at Silas, then back at Hair Tablet. When the report was filed that afternoon, the phrase appeared exactly as Grant wanted it. Possible driver confusion during moisture event. System self-corrected. Silas read those words on the copy Maya quietly emailed to Jonah. He did not get angry. Anger would have been easier. Instead, he went to the shed and opened Amos's notebook again. Jonah followed him, carrying the printed report like it had become heavier since leaving the office. "Granddad," Jonah said, "what does red 14 have to do with a gate blinking wrong?" Silas did not answer at first. He turned to the 1971 page and angled it beneath the workbench lamp. Jonah leaned closer. The old pencil marks looked weak, nearly swallowed by time. Red 14, missing before report. Below it, there was another line Silas had never noticed clearly because Amos had written it across the fold. E.T. took red at 5:40, never logged back. Jonah read it twice. "E.T.," he said quietly. "Earl Tanner?" Silas's mouth tightened. The shed seemed colder. If Earl Tanner had taken red 14 at 5:40, and the report later said the red signal had been visible, then someone had lied about what was on the line. Or someone had removed the only light that could prove what Earl had seen. Jonah looked toward the lantern shelf. For the first time, he did not look at the crates as clutter. He looked at them as if something inside might answer back. Before either man spoke again, Jonah's phone buzzed. It was a message from his friend at the clinic. Emergency transfer tomorrow morning. Mrs. Halpern needs to go through Hollow Bend before dawn. Weather says heavy fog. Jonah read it aloud. Silas closed Amos's notebook. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Silas reached for Red 14, the yellow caution lamp, and the cracked white hand signal lantern. Jonah did not tell him to stop. Outside, the evening air was already cooling. Down in the hollow, invisible from the house, the ditch water waited beside the tracks. And by morning, Hollow Bend would no longer be offering signs. It would be demanding a decision. By 5:11 the next morning, the fog had already swallowed the lower pasture. Silas saw it from his porch before Jonah's truck pulled into the yard. It lay over Hollow Bend like an old sheet over furniture. The air smelled of wet gravel and cold grass. Jonah stepped out with his jacket half-zipped and worry on his face. "The ambulance leaves the clinic at 5:30, he said. Silas nodded. On the porch beside him sat Red 14, the yellow caution lantern, the cracked white hand signal lamp, and Amos's hand-cranked signal lamp wrapped in canvas. Jonah looked at them. This time, he did not ask why. They drove toward Hollow Bend in silence. At the top of the rise, Jonah slowed. Below them, the crossing lights pulsed faintly through the fog, sometimes red, sometimes only a dull smear. A county service truck was parked near the control cabinet. Maya Cross stood beside it with a tablet. Grant Keller was on his phone. That told Silas enough. At 5:36, the clinic ambulance came down the road with its strobes flashing. Behind it, 2 school buses followed at a cautious distance. A detour from a flooded county road had pushed morning traffic through Hollow Bend earlier than usual. The ambulance reached the crossing and slowed. The gates remained up. Maya looked down at her tablet. Silas saw her face change. Then the right gate dropped halfway. The left gate stayed up. The warning bell gave 3 sharp chirps, stopped, and began again out of rhythm. The ambulance driver hesitated. He could not go forward. He could not back up because the first school bus had rolled too close behind him. The second bus stopped near the ditch. Somewhere in the fog, a horn sounded. Long. Low. Too close. Maya shouted toward Grant, "I'm getting a block conflict." Grant lowered his phone. "Reset it." "I tried." "Remote reset. It's not accepting." The horn came again, bent by fog until it seemed everywhere. Silas opened the truck door. Jonah grabbed his sleeve. "Granddad." Silas looked at him. "Stay where drivers can see you." Then he stepped into the road with Red 14 inches one hand and the white lamp in the other. The youngest technician yelled, "Sir, get back." Grant turned. "You cannot interfere with an automated crossing." Silas did not look at him. He looked at the ambulance driver first. The man's window was down, his face pale in the red strobe light. Silas held Red 14 steady at shoulder height. "Stop." Then he raised the white lamp and swept it slow across his body. "Back." The driver stared, confused for half a second. Then something old and human passed between them. A man in danger seeing another man who knew exactly what he was telling him to do. The ambulance began reversing by inches. Jonah ran to the first bus and slapped the side panel. "Back up, slow. Follow his light." Maya finally moved. She left the tablet on the cabinet and ran toward the road, waving both arms at the second bus to angle away from the ditch. Grant shouted something about liability, but the fog swallowed most of it. Silas swung, yellow low. "Ease down." He held Red steady again. "Stop." The ambulance cleared 6 feet. Then 10. Then enough for the front wheels to angle away from the track. The first bus backed with a groan of brakes. The second bus followed badly, then corrected when Maya stood in front of it and pointed hard toward the shoulder. The train horn tore through the fog. This time, everyone felt it in their ribs. The freight was not racing. That was the mercy. But heavy trains do not need speed to become unstoppable. They only need distance they do not have. Silas turned toward the rails and cranked Amos's signal lamp. The beam cut the fog in broken pulses. 3 short sweeps, 1 long hold, then red high and fixed. Emergency obstruction. Reduce. Hold. It was not official anymore. But railroad men still knew ghosts of older languages. When a light appeared where no light should be, a shape emerged in the fog, the blunt nose of the freight engine, darker than the morning around it. Its brakes screamed. Maya stood frozen near the ditch. Grant stopped shouting. The ambulance cleared the crossing just as the first engine rolled through, slow enough to spare them, close enough to shake the breath from every person watching. Children sat silent behind fogged bus windows. Jonah had one hand on the hood of the bus, his head bowed. The train passed. One car, then another, then another. No one spoke until the last wheels faded into the white. Only then did the smart crossing gates finish lowering all the way. The bell began to ring perfectly. Too late. Silas lowered Red 14. For a long moment, the only sound was the bell announcing a danger that had already passed. Maya turned slowly toward the control cabinet. Her tablet lay face up on the metal box, showing a green status line. Track clear. She looked at the screen, then at the rails, then at Silas. Whatever was left of her certainty broke in front of him. Grant recovered first. We need to document this as operator interference and visibility disruption. Maya stared at him. The system showed clear. It corrected after reset. No, she said. It completed after the train entered the crossing. Grant's jaw tightened. Careful. Silas heard that word. So did Maya. Careful was the language of cover-ups. Careful meant protect the contract. Careful meant choose words that kept blame moving away from the people who could afford lawyers. Silas looked down at Red 14. Fog beaded on the dark red glass. For a moment, the lantern reflected the crossing gate's striped arm, red across white, white through red. Something about that reflection pulled an old memory loose. Amos at the kitchen table, a red globe wrapped in newspaper. His father saying, "If a red light disappears, they can make any man look careless." Silas's hand tightened around the handle. He turned Red 14 toward the gate arm and saw what he had missed for years. The replacement glass was not merely wrong. Its shade matched the old emergency gate lens used at Hollow Bend before the 1971 upgrade. That meant Red 14 had not just gone missing. Someone had rebuilt it with glass from the crossing itself. Maya stepped closer, still shaken. Mr. Boone, Silas was no longer looking at the smart crossing. He was looking through 50 years. The red light Earl Tanner carried, Silas said quietly, was changed after the wreck. Jonah looked up. What? Silas lifted the lantern, and the fog turned its cracked globe almost black. They didn't only blame him, he said. They changed what he was holding. The bell finally stopped. In the sudden quiet, Maya looked at Red 14, as if it had become more dangerous than the train. Grant Keller looked at it too. And for the first time since Silas had met him, Grant did not smile. The crossing had failed in front of everyone. But the larger failure had only begun to show itself. By noon, the county would try to name it a weather anomaly. By evening, someone would come looking for the lantern, and Silas would learn that the people most afraid of old lights were the ones who knew what they could reveal. By noon, the county had already found a softer name for what happened at Hollow Bend. Weather anomaly. Not system failure. Not near collision. Not false clear. Weather anomaly. The phrase appeared first in an internal email Jonah saw on Maya Cross's tablet when she came back to the crossing after the train had cleared. Then it appeared in a draft statement from the county transit office. By early afternoon, Grant Keller was repeating it to anyone with a camera close enough to hear. Unusual visibility conditions, he said. Driver congestion. Manual interference by a private citizen. The system completed its safety response. Silas stood near his pickup with Red 14 wrapped in canvas under one arm. He had saved the ambulance. He had helped clear 2 school buses. He had watched the freight roll through a crossing the system still called clear. Yet the words were already moving around him, changing shape before the truth could harden. That frightened him more than the train. Maya knew it too. She stood by the control cabinet with her face pale and her hair coming loose from its clip. Her tablet still showed logs from the morning. She had copied them twice before Grant noticed. Those records belong to the project, Grant said. They belong to the incident, Maya replied. They are preliminary. They show track clear during an active approach. Grant stepped closer. They show a sensor conflict during heavy fog, followed by field interference. Maya looked at Silas. Silas said nothing. He did not need to. She had been there. She had heard the horn. She had seen the tablet lie in green letters. Grant lowered his voice. Careful, Maya. Written wrong, this can end a career. That was the second time Silas heard the word careful. The first had come before the wreck was even cold. Jonah moved to Silas's side. We should leave. Grant turned toward them. "Mr. Boone, the county will need a statement from you." "You have one," Silas said. The crossing failed. Grant's face hardened. "That is not your determination to make." "No," Silas said. "It's what I saw." "And what you did," Grant added, "was enter an active rail crossing with unapproved signaling equipment." Jonah stiffened. "He saved people." Grant smiled without warmth. "That may depend on how the report reads." Jonah understood then that the morning had not ended with the train. It had only changed tracks. His grandfather had not become safe because he was right. In some ways, being right had made him more exposed. By late afternoon, someone from the county asked the ambulance driver for dash footage. Someone else called the bus depot. A technician removed a memory card from a service camera near the cabinet and placed it in an evidence envelope Grant signed, before anyone from the sheriff's office arrived. Maya watched all of it. Then, when Grant went to speak with the commissioner, she walked to Silas's truck. "I made my own copy of the diagnostic log," she said quietly. Jonah looked around. "Can you do that?" Maya's mouth tightened. "I don't know anymore." She handed Jonah a small folded note instead of a file. On it, she had written 3 times, 539, 540, 541. Beside each time were status codes and one phrase, "Track clear." "Keep that," she said, "not in your phone." Then she left before either man could thank her. That evening, Silas found Walter Ames waiting on his porch. He was older than Silas by maybe 5 years, thin as a fence rail, dressed in a dark overcoat too formal for a farmhouse porch. His hair was white and combed neatly back. One hand rested on a cane, the other held his hat. Silas knew him at once, though he had not seen him in decades. Walter Ames had been a railroad attorney after the 1971 accident. Not the man who shouted, not the man who stood in front of cameras. He was the man who wrote words other men signed. "Silas," Walter said. Silas stopped at the bottom step. Jonah stood behind him, holding red 14 wrapped in canvas. Walter's eyes dropped to the bundle. "You should have let that stay in the shed," he said. Silas climbed 1 step. "Why?" "Because old blame keeps better buried." There it was. Not denial, not confusion, recognition. Silas felt something cold open inside his chest. "You knew about Red 14. Walter looked toward the road, as if the cottonwoods might be listening. "I knew about a great many things I was too young and too ambitious to understand properly." "You were 38, Silas said. "That's old enough." Walter accepted the blow with a small nod. "Yes," Jonah spoke before Silas could. "If you know something, say it." Walter looked at Jonah with tired eyes. "Young man, truth is not a lantern you simply lift. Once it's seen, it burns everything around it." Silas stepped onto the porch. Earl Tanner burned first. Walter's face changed, only for a moment. "But enough. Do not dig this up without knowing what you will lose," Walter said. "Your father's name is closer to it than you think." Silas had expected anger. Maybe denial. Maybe threat. He had not expected that. Before he could answer, headlights turned into the driveway. An old green sedan stopped behind Jonah's truck. A woman in her late 40s stepped out. She wore work pants, a gray coat, and the guarded expression of someone who had learned long ago not to ask for kindness from this town. "Silas Boone?" she called. Walter closed his eyes. Silas turned. "Yes." The woman walked toward the porch. "My name is Lydia Tanner." Jonah looked at Silas. The name made the evening seem to narrow. Lydia stopped near the bottom step. Her gaze went first to Silas, then to Walter, then to the canvas bundle under Jonah's arm. "My grandfather was Earl Tanner," she said. "I heard you had his lantern." No one answered quickly enough. Lydia's jaw tightened. "For 50 years, people in this town said he missed a signal. My grandmother died hearing that whisper behind her back. My mother left because of it. I grew up knowing people would rather call him careless than look at who wrote the report." Walter said softly, "Miss Tanner." She cut him off without looking at him. "Don't." Then she looked at Silas again. "I don't care about your crossing. I don't care about your feud with the county. I want to know why my grandfather's initials are on something your family kept hidden." The words struck Silas harder than Grant's threat, because she was right. Red 14 had sat in his shed, wrapped in his feed sacks, protected by his stubbornness, explained by his family wound. But it had another man's initials scratched into the rim, another family's grief, another claim. Silas turned to Jonah. "Bring it inside," he said. Walter gripped his cane. Silas, listen to me. Silas looked back at the old attorney. I did. For 50 years, everybody listened to men like you. Then he opened the door. Lydia Tanner stepped into the Boone house without removing her coat. Jonah carried Red 14 to the kitchen table. Walter Ames stood on the porch for a long moment before following them in. Outside, fog was beginning to collect again in the low ground. Inside, Silas unwrapped the lantern. And for the first time, the question was no longer whether the old light could prove him right. The question was, who had the right to hold it when the full truth came out? Red 14 looked smaller on Silas Boone's kitchen table than it ever had in the shed. Maybe it was the light. Maybe it was Lydia Tanner standing across from it with both hands flat on the worn wood, staring as if the lantern might move if she looked away. Maybe it was Walter Ames sitting near the wall with his hat on his knees, old enough now to seem harmless, but not harmless enough for anyone in that room to trust. Jonah placed Amos's notebook beside the lantern. Silas unfolded Maya's note with the diagnostic times from that morning and set it near the notebook. 3 pieces of paper, 1 old lantern, 4 people who had inherited a lie in different ways. Lydia spoke first. My grandmother used to say Earl checked everything twice, she said. She said that was why the blame killed her, not because he died, because they made him careless after he couldn't answer. Silas looked down. He had no defense for that. A knock came at the back door just after 7. Jonah opened it and found Maya Cross standing there with a folder held under her coat. Her face looked different away from the county trucks and reflective vests. Younger, somehow. More frightened. I shouldn't be here, she said. Silas stepped aside. Then you know why you are. Maya entered and placed the folder on the table. Inside were printed screenshots from the Smart Crossing log, a copy of the county's draft incident statement, and a scanned accident report from 1971 she had pulled from an old state rail archive before access disappeared behind a records request. Walter looked at the folder and went very still. Maya noticed. You've seen this report before, she said. Walter did not answer. Silas opened the 1971 accident report with hands that had begun to tremble. The language was clean and official. Too clean. Earl Tanner failed to confirm stop signal. Visibility limited but acceptable. Equipment present and functioning. No evidence of signal removal prior to collision. Maya pointed to one line. Equipment present and functioning, she said. That means Red 14 should have been recovered at the scene. Silas turned Amos's notebook toward her. Red 14, missing before report. Below it, E.T. took Red at 5:40. Never logged back. Lydia whispered. He had it. Silas nodded slowly. Your grandfather was carrying the stoplight. Maya turned the lantern over carefully, using a towel so she would not touch the metal directly. She studied the rim, the solder, the dark red glass. This globe doesn't match the lantern body, she said. Silas already knew it, but hearing someone else say it made the room tighten. Maya continued. The collar is older. The glass is from a different fixture. See the curve? This was cut down from a larger lens. Silas pointed toward the crossing report. The emergency gate lens at Hollow Bend. Walter closed his eyes. That small movement was confession before words arrived. Lydia saw it too. Say it. Walter opened his eyes. You don't understand what the railroad was then. I understand my grandfather died. Walter's mouth worked once before sound came. After the accident, the company could not afford another signal scandal. There had been complaints about Hollow Bend for years. Fog interference, delayed maintenance, lamp visibility. Your grandfather was dead. The maintenance crew was scattered. Amos Boone was the only man left who could contradict the field report. Silas felt Jonah look at him. Walter kept his gaze on the table. Red 14 was not logged at the scene when the investigator arrived. That was a problem. A missing stop lantern suggested Earl Tanner had not ignored the signal. It suggested the signal record was incomplete. Lydia's voice was low. So they put it back. No, Walter said. They made it look like it had never mattered. Silas leaned forward. Who changed the glass? Walter's face seemed to collapse inward. A shop foreman replaced the broken globe with a lens cut from the old gate assembly. The original glass was gone. Crushed, they said. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. I never saw it. And my father? Silas asked. Walter looked at him then. That was the moment Silas had feared without naming it for 50 years. Amos knew Red 14 had been removed before the report was finalized, Walter said. He knew Earl had carried the stoplight. He objected once. Privately. Once, Lydia said. Walter nodded. Once. Silas's hand closed around the edge of the table. Walter's voice grew weaker. The railroad told him his pension could be reviewed. They told him his maintenance records could be questioned. They told him his son's job application with the line would never be considered. They did not threaten him like villains in a story. They only showed him how easily a working man's life could be made smaller. Silas looked at the notebook. He had spent decades imagining Amos as a man chained by force. Maybe he had been, but chains did not have to be iron. Sometimes they were fear, mortgage, pension, a son's future, a wife's medicine, a town that preferred a dead brakeman to a corporate failure. Still, the truth did not soften. Amos had signed. Maya found the supplemental statement near the back of the file. The copy was grainy, but the signature was clear. Silas Boone. Signal equipment accounted for to the best of my knowledge. Silas stared at his father's name until the letters blurred. Jonah whispered, "Granddad." Silas lifted one hand, not to stop him, but because he could not bear comfort yet. Lydia did not cry. That made it worse. She only looked at the paper as if it confirmed something her family had known without proof for half a century. "My grandmother lost the house 2 years after Earl died," she said. "No settlement, no railroad pension, no apology. People stopped hiring her for sewing because they thought she'd spend the whole day talking about how Earl was blamed. My mother left this county at 17 and never came back except to bury her. We did not just lose him. We lost every room where his name was safe." No one spoke. That was the first consequence. A family lost money they should have had. The second was worse. They lost the right to grieve without defending the dead. The third sat across from Silas in the shape of Lydia Tanner, who had grown up carrying a shame that did not belong to her. Maya turned to Grant's draft statement from that morning. Weather anomaly, driver congestion, manual interference. She placed it beside the 1,971 report. The resemblance was not in the details. It was in the grammar. Both documents tried to move blame away from machinery, contracts, and men with authority. Both made ordinary people look confused in the presence of systems that had failed them. Silas looked at Walter. "You wrote this kind of language before." Walter nodded once. "Yes. Can you undo it?" Walter's laugh was almost silent. "No." Lydia pushed back from the table. "Then why are you here?" Walter looked older than he had on the porch. "Because I can say I helped write it. I can say Amos objected. I can say the missing lantern was discussed before the final report. I can sign that much." "That much," Lydia repeated. Her voice held no forgiveness. Silas reached for Red 14. For a second, everyone thought he meant to pull it closer. Instead, he turned the lantern and slid it across the table toward Lydia Tanner. Jonah inhaled. Walter looked away. Silas kept his palm on the handle until Lydia's fingers touched the other side. "I thought I was keeping it for my father," Silas said. "I was wrong." Lydia did not take it immediately. Silas forced himself to continue. "If this light belongs to anyone now, it belongs first to the family that was left in the dark." Lydia's face changed then, not into softness, not yet, but into something more painful than anger, recognition, maybe, or the first break in a door that had been locked for too long. Maya gathered the papers. "There has to be a hearing," she said, "for the crossing, for today, and if this report is tied to the same location, the county cannot keep them separate." Walter nodded. "If I sign an affidavit, they will have to answer questions." Silas looked at Amos's notebook one last time. He still loved his father. That was the hardest part. Love did not vanish just because truth entered the room. It only became heavier, more complicated, less obedient to memory. Outside, a train horn sounded far beyond Hollow Bend. This time, no one moved toward the window. The old lie had finally made a sound everyone could hear. And by morning, Silas Boone would have to carry both truths into public. That his father had tried once, and that once had not been enough. The public hearing was scheduled for Friday afternoon, but by noon every seat in the county chamber had already been taken. People came because of the crossing. They came because 2 school buses and an ambulance had nearly been caught in the fog. They came because a video showed Silas Boone standing in the road with a red lantern while the smart gates lowered too late behind him. But not everyone came for the same truth. Some wanted the county blamed. Some wanted Grant Keller blamed. Some wanted everything settled quickly so Hollow Bend could reopen. Lydia Tanner sat in the second row with red 14 inches, a padded box on her lap. Silas sat beside her, not because the lantern belonged to him, but because Lydia had asked him to. Jonah sat on Silas's other side. The night before, Jonah had said what he had been too ashamed to say earlier. "I thought I was protecting you," he told Silas. "But I made it sound like you were embarrassing me." Silas answered quietly, "I was carrying it wrong, too." That was the closest either of them came to forgiveness that night. But in the county chamber, Jonah stayed close enough whenever people turned to stare. The hearing began with familiar language. Preliminary review. Unusual weather condition. Visibility event. Public safety response. Grant Keller sat at the front table with the county transit director. He said the system had encountered a rare fog interference pattern. He said manual actions by civilians complicated the automated response. He said the company would cooperate with review. Then, Maya Cross stood. She placed 3 printed logs on the evidence table and spoke into the microphone. At 5:39, the crossing registered track clear, while an active freight approach signal existed upstream. At 5:40, the system maintained clear status despite visual confirmation of the train horn and gate conflict. At 5:41, the gates completed lowering after the engine entered the crossing. The room changed, not loudly. Truth rarely enters as thunder. Sometimes it arrives as paper sliding across a table. Grant leaned toward his microphone. "Those logs require technical interpretation." Maya nodded. "Yes, that is why I am interpreting them." A few people murmured. She continued. "Mr. Boone's manual signaling did not create the hazard. It reduced it. The hazard existed before he entered the roadway." The transit director asked if she was certain. Maya looked down once. When she lifted her eyes, the uncertainty was gone, though fear remained behind it. "Yes," she said, "and I should have requested a fog, condition field test before final certification." It was not a dramatic apology. It was better than that. It cost her something. Then Walter Ames was called. He moved slowly to the front, leaning on his cane. Lydia did not move, but her fingers tightened around the box holding Red 14. Walter swore his statement with a voice almost too thin for what it carried. He confirmed that after the 1971 accident, Red 14 had been discussed before the final report. He confirmed the missing lantern, raised questions about whether Earl Tanner had ignored a visible stop signal. He confirmed that the final language was softened to protect the railroad from liability. The clerk asked why he had not come forward earlier. Walter looked at Lydia. "No one else. Because I benefited from silence," he said. The chamber went still. "I kept my position. I kept my reputation. I told myself I had not caused the accident, so I was not responsible for the lie that followed. That was cowardice dressed as professionalism." Lydia's face did not soften. Some confessions deserve to be heard without being rewarded. Walter signed the affidavit with a shaking hand. When he returned to his seat, no one applauded. Then Lydia was invited to speak. She carried Red 14 to the evidence table and removed it from the box. The cracked globe caught the overhead lights and turned dark red, almost black at the edges. "My grandfather was not a perfect man," she said. "I'm not here to make him into one. I'm here because a dead man deserves not to be used as a convenient place to put blame." Her voice held steady. "My grandmother lost her house. My mother left this county. My family learned to lower our voices when the Tanner name came up. That did not happen because of fog. It happened because people wrote a report that made a failed system look innocent and a working man look careless." She turned toward the commissioners. "If you call what happened last week a weather anomaly, you are doing the same thing again." No one answered. That silence was different from the silence at the ribbon cutting. That one had protected embarrassment. This one held shame. The county ordered an independent review of the smart crossing before reopening Hollow Bend. Grant Keller's contract was suspended. Maya's logs were entered into the record. Walter's affidavit was attached to a petition to reopen the 1971 accident finding. None of it fixed the past, but it stopped the old machinery of denial from moving forward untouched. After the hearing, a bus driver shook Silas's hand. The ambulance driver hugged Maya. Someone from the school board asked Jonah whether Silas might help teach a safety session once the review was complete. Jonah looked at his grandfather first. Silas looked at Lydia. "It should carry Earl Tanner's name," Silas said. Lydia studied him. Then she nodded once. Not forgiveness. Permission. By evening, the county announced 2 funds, one for Hollow Bend crossing safety training, and 1 scholarship for trade students under Earl Tanner's name. The scholarship was small at first, but 26 people donated before midnight. Silas went home tired enough to feel every year in his bones. On the kitchen table lay Amos's notebook, no longer closed around a family secret. Beside it sat an empty space where Red 14 had been. Jonah noticed him looking at it. "Do you want it back?" he asked. Silas shook his head. "No," he said. "For the first time, it's where it should be." Outside, the night settled over the rails, and somewhere beyond the dark, Hollow Bend waited for the work that would come next. By the time Hollow Bend reopened, summer had already begun leaning toward fall. The cottonwoods had lost some of their deep green. The ditch grass stood high and yellow at the edges. New gravel had been laid along the shoulder, and the smart crossing cabinet had been replaced with a wider one that carried 2 systems instead of 1. The county called it a layered safety protocol. Silas called it common sense. There were still sensors, remote diagnostics, automated alerts, and backup batteries. Maya Cross had helped redesign the fog response settings after the independent review confirmed what she already knew. Hollow Bend did not behave like an ordinary crossing in low weather. But now there was also a manual override station locked behind a glass panel. There were painted fog markers along the road. There was a local volunteer call list. And in a small metal case inside the county maintenance shed, 3 training lanterns waited beside laminated instructions. No one was allowed to call obsolete. The first safety class was held on a Saturday morning. Only 12 people came, but Silas said 12 was more than enough for a beginning. 2 bus drivers, a sheriff's deputy, a clinic driver, 3 high school boys who mostly came because Jonah had promised them donuts, a young woman from dispatch, Maya, Jonah, and Lydia Tanner, who sat in the back and listened without taking notes. Silas stood at the front with a yellow lantern in one hand and a white one on the table beside him. He did not begin with 1,971. He began with distance. "Machines count what they're built to count," he said. "People have to notice what the machine doesn't know it missed." Maya stood beside him, not as the young engineer who had mocked an old warning, but as the person who could explain where modern systems were strong and where they needed human backup. She showed them the new alert panel. Silas showed them what a steady red light meant when fog turned every headlight into a blur. Jonah watched closely. At first, he held the lantern like an object. By the 3rd session, he held it like a sentence. Red steady. Stop. Yellow low, slow swing. Ease down. White sweep across the body. Back up. Silas corrected his wrist twice. Jonah did not complain. That alone would have made the old man smile if the lesson had not mattered so much. One afternoon, after class, Jonah stayed behind while Silas packed the lanterns away. "I used to think you were trying to keep the past from dying," Jonah said. Silas closed the metal case. "I think I was." Jonah nodded toward the crossing. "Now?" Silas looked at the rails. "Now I think the past should work for a living." That was how the town changed too. Not all at once. Not beautifully. Some people still lowered their voices when the 1,971 case came up. Grant Keller's company fought the suspension. The railroad's successor company denied responsibility in careful language that sounded too familiar to everyone who had sat through the hearing. The petition to revise Earl Tanner's accident finding was still open. Legal truth moved slower than fog. But it moved. Walter Ames signed 2 more statements before winter. He died before the state board issued a decision. Lydia did not attend his funeral, and no one asked her to. Forgiveness was not a debt the injured owed to the ashamed. Red 14 never went into a museum. Lydia kept it in her house, in a cedar box her mother had once used for sewing patterns. Sometimes, on Sundays, she took it out and set it on the kitchen table beside a photograph of Earl Tanner in his railroad coat. Not for display, not for visitors, for family. One evening, she invited Silas and Jonah over. Silas stood in Lydia's kitchen for a long time before he touched the back of a chair. On the table, Red 14 rested beside Earl's photograph and a copy of Walter's affidavit. The cracked globe caught the lamplight. It did not look like victory. It looked like something that had survived being misused. Lydia handed Silas a folded paper. It was a copy of the scholarship notice. The Earl Tanner Trade Safety Fund. Beneath it, in smaller letters, was another line, supported in part by the Boone Family Lantern Training Program. Silas read it twice. "My father's name doesn't need to be there," he said. Lydia looked at him. "It isn't. Yours is." He could not answer right away. That night, after Jonah drove him home, Silas opened Amos's notebook for the last time that year. He did not tear out the page. He did not hide it. He wrote one line beneath the old entry. Red 14 returned to Tanner family. Then he closed the book and placed it on the shelf, not in the crate with the lanterns, but beside the family Bible and his mother's old recipe tin. Some truths did not become lighter. They only found a place where they could be carried honestly. In October, the first heavy fog came. The county did not close Hollow Bend. Instead, the new system shifted into fog protocol before dawn. The warning lights pulsed cleanly. The dispatch alert went out. Jonah received the volunteer message at 5:18 and drove Silas to the crossing before the first school bus came over the rise. Maya was already there. She checked the cabinet. Jonah unlocked the manual station. Silas stood by the shoulder with a training lantern in his hand. Not Red 14, not the evidence, just an ordinary red lantern made useful by meaning. A freight train sounded somewhere beyond the white. This time, the gates lowered early. This time, the tablet showed approach. This time, the road stayed clear. Jonah stood beside Silas, holding the yellow lantern correctly without being told. Fog moved around them, thick and cold, but it no longer felt like a thing hiding a secret. It felt like weather again. The train passed slowly through Hollow Bend. Maya watched the signal panel. Jonah watched the rails. Silas watched the light in his grandson's hand. When the last car faded into the fog, Jonah looked over. "Do you think old ways are better?" Silas shook his head. "No," he said. "Old ways aren't better because they're old. New ways aren't better because they're new." He looked down the track, where the fog had begun to thin. A light is only good if somebody respects what it means. Jonah held the yellow lantern a little steadier. Above them, the smart crossing lights blinked red through the morning. Beside them, the old lantern burned warm in human hands. Neither light had to defeat the other. They only had to keep the next person from disappearing into the fog.